In the near term, I think there's going to be some higher prices on some things. I think in the long term, this is going to be the single greatest play for the American economy in our lifetimes. And the final thing I'll say on this before bringing in the great Corey Lewandowski is if the trade is that I experience and you experience and we all experience some short-term pain in a 401k or in the market, money's liquid, man. Losing money costs you absolutely nothing. Losing your country costs you everything. Option B is to preserve this country and to strengthen it and to put up walls around this nation to make sure that my children have a future and are not tax chattel for a globalist elite that view them as less worthy of a job and dignity than a Vietnamese peasant. Yeah, man, I'm going to take the second option any day. Please, I will gladly pay more for my iPhone. That is a very simple choice for me. There's plenty of plastic, pointless luxuries that we have in this country that ain't worth it.
All right. My name is Ben Burgis. This is Give Them an Argument. I am joined as always by our super producer, Jake Appett, and our very talented graphic designer, J. Andrew World. The voice you just heard was popular right-wing influencer Benny Johnson explaining that, hey, man, you should free your mind and not care so much about these crass, material possessions. You can't take it with you. Why are you so concerned about money anyway? Money is kind of meaningless if you think about it.
Yeah, it's a good point. I mean, I think a lot of us on the left would agree that maybe, paying a little bit more for an item to actually pay the workers that are creating that item might be worth it. That's what he was referring to, right? It was like something like that, or was it something else?
I don't know. I got real confused when he started talking about the Vietnamese peasants. I wasn't sure how they factored in.
I really wanted. I wish we were gonna run into copyright laws because I wanted like Radiohead's "Fake Plastic Trees" just playing in the background. He has an epiphany about all the pointless plastic products, which I happen to agree with him. And then we should check in with Benny now that Trump is starting to roll some of that back. He must be distraught, right? Because he was so excited about the tariffs.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, there's definitely no chance that if we look into what he's saying now, he's like praising Trump for his genius art of the deal for like pulling back the tariffs. Yeah, no, it's incredible. It actually is genuinely cult-like how they keep going back and forth between those two things. And also, like, all of last year, the price of eggs was the most important thing in the universe. And, and now it's like money, what is money anyway, man? Like, why are you so hung up on this?
They all took ayahuasca in the rainforest in between now and then.
Yeah, money's just a concept, man.
Yeah. And then they got back home from their trip and they were like, what the fuck was I on during that ayahuasca journey?
Yeah, exactly. And yeah, no, it's I have a lot to say about this. The opening arguments could be all about tariffs, but after that, we are going to have two of my favorite past guests, Matt Bruenig and Luke Savage, who are going to come on to talk about the reviews that the two of them wrote of Ezra Klein and Derek Thompson's much discussed book, Abundance. I actually had to, Matt having like a family and stuff like that, right? Like, like isn't available to be on YouTube at all hours of the night, like us cool guys are. But so we had to pre-record this in the afternoon or late morning my time, and I actually think it's like one of the sort of best and most interesting discussions we've had on the show in a little while, right? So I'm really looking forward to being able to share that.
Nice. So with that, are we ready to go into the opening argument then?
Let's do it.
Oh, wait. We have the, Ben's song first.
Gotta be streaming. Debunk all of it.
Logical analysis. You're going to show us how to argue it out. Go.
This is based on data from a bunch of different countries. There's abundant evidence that at this point.
First, we had Liberation Day, when Trump announced sweeping across-the-board tariffs on damn near every country on the planet. Then, less than a week after Liberation Day, we had, I guess, what we can call Just Kidding Day, when Trump announced that he was suspending most of the big tariffs on most countries, but actually also simultaneously doing an even bigger tariff on China. And then he announced right after that, the gigantic tariff on China was actually going to come with carve-outs for so many of the most important electronic goods that we buy from China, that it actually worked out to disincentivize domestic manufacturing of those things, if you look at the details, because any American manufacturer would have to pay crazy heavy tariffs on all the component parts, while the entirely Chinese manufactured versions would actually come in without the tariffs. But of course, what I'm describing is Trump's tariff policy as of a couple of days ago. And I didn't whip out my phone before starting this segment to check out how the policy might have changed. So whatever it is now, it's probably totally different than what I'm describing. And, wait another 72 hours after that, and it'll be different again, because none of this is going through Congress. It's all being done by presidential decree through this fake national emergency status that lets Trump change it every time he has a new whim, which happens a lot. It's a giant mess, and it's quite likely that this cascade of presidential whims is going to get us an awful lot of pain for ordinary working class consumers at the grocery store for a while at absolutely best, and a huge economic crisis at worst. And the way he's doing it pretty well guarantees that we're not even going to reshore any jobs in the process. So that if the question on the table is what Trump is doing a good idea, I guess I would suggest that that's not a very interesting question. Just to be clear, the answer is no. Although in a minute, we'll play you a clip of somebody who disagrees, with a different take on that. For the moment, though, I'll just note that, like in that Benny Johnson clip we were just watching, it's very, very funny in a very grim way that all these right-wing influencers who are normally all about capital T, capital E, the economy as the be-all and end-all of everything, and regularly cream their boxers thinking about the glories of the free market, have suddenly started to sound these themes about how, hey, why do you care about crass material possessions anyway? Don't you know desire is the root of suffering? But the reason I'm talking about tariffs right now is that I think there are questions we can ask here that are a hell of a lot more interesting than, is what Trump is doing good? Or do we all feel nice and liberated since Liberation Day? Because there's a broader set of questions here about how to respond and push back against this swirling chaos of the Trump 2.0 administration and put forward an alternative vision. And I want to take a long step back and think about that bigger question, then come back and bring it to the point I want to make about tariffs. I think I've been pretty clear on this show that I'm really not the kind of leftist who thinks that Democrats and Republicans are exactly the same, and it doesn't matter for the left or the workers' movement whether we're ruled by the comparatively moderate wing of capital or by the most militant and demented wing of capital. I've seen a lot of people in comments on these YouTube videos say I have TDS. If you're not hopelessly online, that stands for Trump derangement syndrome, because I think that Trumpism 2.0 is, in fact, disturbingly authoritarian and dangerous. And we are actually reaching the point where we need to be talking about defending liberal democracy as such. Those of us who want to replace liberal capitalist democracy with something better should be worried about the possibility that it's going to be replaced with something worse, or at least degraded in that direction. In an article that Deep State Cuba and I wrote last fall before the election, I think I might have forgotten to ask for that graphic. Don't worry about it. We warned that Trump 2.0 might be a lot more competently authoritarian than Trump 1.0 was. Now we do have it. Like what we said in that article is that hey, just because they weren't able to sort of push through the bureaucratic obstacles and make it come to pass last time, don't count out just yet the possibility that we're going to get that MAGA dystopia. And we had a whole theory in that article of why that might be the case. But I'll also freely admit that this has been even worse than I was expecting in terms of the Trump administration limbo dancing under even my expectations for how closely they would adhere to the constitutional order. They're deporting legal residents for writing newspaper op-eds and courting a constitutional crisis by defying a 9-0 Supreme Court ruling that they need to bring back an innocent person they, accidentally sent to a Salvadorian gulag. It's grim. In fact, this is the first opening argument I've done in the last 3 where I haven't primarily focused on free speech, because Trump's war on free speech protections has been a lot, and I mean a lot, of what's been preoccupying me lately. But again, that's not what I'm talking about today. I actually do want to focus, like Star Wars Episode 1, The Phantom Menace, on the taxation of trade routes. Before I get back to that, though, the reason I'm talking about the broader picture of how horrifying the first few months of Trump 2 have been is because I want to frame this issue about tariffs in the larger context of Trumpism and the public backlash against Trumpism and how it's been playing out on a lot of different issues, not just this one. A week and a half ago, I was in Chicago for an academic conference. While I was there, I was staying with my friend Bronco from Jacobin. And on the Saturday of that week, Bronco and our buddy Miles from In These Times magazine went out to the big anti-Trump hands-off rally. And I actually found it really hardening. The Chicago rally was absolutely gigantic. I heard one estimate that said it was 30,000 people. That feels about right to me. It was also interesting to see the variety of signs people had, the kind of issues that were being raised, with tens of thousands of people, lots of them sort of normie libs kind of being freshly politicized by all the swirling insanity. You're going to get a combination of political messages, including, of course, some that I really disagree with, like people who want the war in Ukraine to keep going forever and had signs like Trump is Putin's bitch. But I was happy to see there really wasn't that much of that. For every sign like that, there were probably like 3 or 4 Free Palestine signs. And while the most common message, very appropriately from my point of view, was probably the one about democracy and authoritarianism, also because of all the Doge insanity, probably the second most popular message I saw was anti-austerity themes. Tons of stuff about hands off Medicaid, hands off Social Security, a massive amount of signs. I think probably a lot from marching veterans about cuts to the Veterans Administration. And I love that. This was, so we've got, I think, my favorite of the pictures I took that day, which is this one, right? Because I love that no kings, no oligarchy sign. And that sign was adjoined on one side by somebody with one about authoritarianism, and then the other by somebody resurrecting the Occupy Wall Street or sort of Bernie campaign language about the 99%. I think that's exactly the right message for the moment. I mean, obviously, I'm a, finicky intellectual nerd. I'd want to I have notes, right? But like the basic thrust of that, tying together the defense of democracy with a more basic point about our society's long-term horrifying levels of economic inequality. Because I don't think those issues can really be disentangled. And this brings us at last to the point I was making about tariffs, which is just this. Yes, Trump is horrifying. Yes, Trumpism 2.0 is a real crisis. But it actually matters. It matters a lot what message you use to fight it. Because there's a reason Trump is president right now. There's a reason he made massive gains with the multiracial working class, winning a higher share of Black voters, a way higher share of Latino voters than he did either of the last 2 times he ran. And for the first time, any Republican has pulled this off in fucking forever. He won a slightly high, he actually won a slight majority of low-income voters. That really shows the absurdity of libs trying to make the beginning and end of their explanation of Trumpism that Trump voters are, big, dumb, backward racists. Trump actually got the most multiracial electorate of any Republican candidate in my lifetime. Doesn't mean he's not a racist, but it does mean there's other stuff going on. And even beyond that, the much more basic point that emerges from this is that Trumpism isn't just some random effusion of evil that came in from an alternate dimension. It is, unfortunately, an all too explicable outgrowth of the sickness of a profoundly unequal society full of economic precarity and misery. It's scapegoating, it's demagoguery, but like that's where it comes from. The much derided phrase economic anxiety actually is the single most important thing to understand if you want to know where this phenomenon comes from. And the second most important thing to understand would be how massively Trump has benefited from his totally unearned misleading reputation for somehow being anti-war. Kamala Harris was going around the country trumpeting the support of the Cheney family, so your average voter not unreasonably concluded that the comparatively anti-war candidate must be the other guy. And the reason I'm relitigating the 2024 election here in the context of setting up what I want to say about tariffs is that understanding where Trumpism comes from is absolutely essential to understanding how you can fight it. Because if the message you're using to combat it is, let's go back to the status quo that people were so disgusted with that the backlash to it led us here, that's the failingest of messages. And this takes us to the core of the point about tariffs. Because here's the problem I want to point out today. A lot of people who might think of themselves even as leftists or socialists basically spend 90% of their time tailing whatever the liberal talking point of the day is and just putting a slightly more radical spin on it. This is something I've been complaining about forever. I mean, since way back when I was co-hosting Dead Pundit Society with Adam Proctor, we used to talk about this all the time. And a lot of grassroots liberals, in turn, have a very strong instinct, a very strong one, to not just oppose whatever Trump is doing, which is the right call somewhere well north of 99% of the time, but to go further than that, to rhetorically take the opposite of whatever Trump's rhetorical stance is. And look, sometimes that works out to be a good thing. When Doge is slashing and burning its way through the federal budget, libs instinctively wanting to say the opposite of what Trump says end up having really good anti-austerity messages, like the ones that were already all over those hands-off rallies. When Elon Musk is treated as de facto co-president and Trump surrounds himself with the top tech billionaires in the world at his inauguration, libs having that anti-Trump reaction suddenly means there's a greatly expanded audience for leftist messages about economic inequality. And Bernie's anti-oligarchy rallies have bigger audiences than his campaign rallies even had when he was running for president. That's all fantastic. But when it comes to tariffs, the same instinct leads to a great many libs just reverting to Clinton-era free trade absolutism, to saying not just that these tariffs are idiotic and pointless and destructive, which is all true, but that the problem is tariffs per se. And anytime the government imposes any new tariff on anything or raises any existing tariff, it's just innately bad, right? So see, it's economic illiteracy, right? To think this could ever be good. That's actually in itself dangerous and stupid. And to set up why I think it's so dangerous and stupid, I want to start on the opposite end of the argument, right? I want to roll a clip from somebody who I think is erring in the other direction, but who in her own inimitable way has promoted the same kind of asinine false dichotomy that you either have to be a free trader or you have to support what Trump is doing. Those are your only options. So this is the clip I was teasing earlier from one Batya Ungar Sargon. This is her rant on the Piers Morgan show that some enterprising Twitter user delightfully set to background music.
And yet when somebody has the courage to show up and say to Wall Street, screw you, I'm waging class warfare on behalf of the American working class, and you elites in Wall Street, you do what you need to do because I'm not going to stop fighting for the American working class. Suddenly everybody is sitting around going, oh no, the stock market. Yeah, the stock market looks like that because the rich are punishing Trump for siding with the neglected and humiliated American working class over them. We have already seen these tariffs work, Pierce.
And I want to contrast Batya's barking lunacy with the position of someone who's actually capable of intellectually walking and chewing bubblegum at the same time, who's my good friend and very frequent GTAA guest, Matt McManus. We have the graphic of his tweet. And in here, he's responding to someone who's a lot smarter than Batya, friend of me of the show, Sohrab Ahmari, who, full disclosure, is a friend of mine, even though we have absolutely massive political and philosophical disagreements. And Sohrab is saying, hey, what, are you guys all free traders now, like objecting to these tariffs? And Matt very wisely responds like this. He says, every progressive I know thinks neoliberalism needs to be replaced. That doesn't mean they want it to be replaced by autarkic mercantilism and ethno-chauvinist nationalism, especially overseen by billionaire oligarchs. No one wants to trade pneumonia for lung cancer. And I would co-sign every word of that tweet, except for the initial phrase, every progressive I know, because maybe this is semantic about who we're calling progressives. But I have very sadly seen quite a few people who could broadly be described as progressive, and even some, fairly left-wing people having trouble walking and chewing bubblegum on the tariff question. But yes, absolutely yes, on the bit about pneumonia and lung cancer. Let's just pause for a second to think about all the reasons that Batya's lunacy about Trump waging class war on behalf of the American working class is in fact lunacy. Let's start with the fact that while one good left-wing reason to actually want more manufacturing jobs to be reshored that's legitimate is that those jobs are actually historically easier to unionize than other kinds of jobs where you tend to have smaller workplaces and where workers have less strategic leverage over capital when they strike. That's all true. But Trump is doing all of this at the same time that he's waging a scorched earth war against organized labor. He made a credible effort to essentially abolish the National Labor Relations Board, illegally firing Gwynne Wilcox and bringing the board below quorum so it can't actually fight back legally against the challenge Elon Musk is waging in the court system, where he's challenging the basic constitutional basis of the NLRB's enforcement powers to protect workers who are fired for organizing unions. As it goes through different appeals courts and stuff, she keeps on being restored to her seat and then removed again, and we'll see what happens. But it might still work, Trump's maneuver there. He's also unilaterally canceled federal workers' collective bargaining agreements and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's probably the most anti-labor presidential administration since Herbert Hoover. So even if his sweeping and chaotic tariffs somehow led to jobs coming back, which they fucking won't, Trump would do everything in his power to guarantee that they wouldn't be union jobs, which means that the working class wouldn't be able to capture any real chunk of the benefits of the reshoring. Because look, the reason people miss factory jobs and, coal mine jobs and et cetera, and want them to come back in those regions, even if they're not unemployed, even if they've managed to get service industry jobs, isn't because factory work or mine work was innately more fun. Trust me, I have known people from back, where I grew up who, worked in auto factories. Hey, Matt, if you're watching the show right now. And I've heard stories. My dad worked in an auto factory, for a bit in the 70s, and he still has a scar from a workplace accident back then. These are not innately fun jobs. The reason they were desirable jobs was because powerful industrial unions like the UAW, following the successes of the sit-down strike era, were able to use the collective power of those workers, their strategic leverage in key industries against capital, to deliver a decent, quote-unquote, middle-class lifestyle for those workers. And without unions, those jobs are a nightmare. As one of our guests in the main event tonight, Matt Bruenig, has pointed out, McDonald's workers in Denmark make more than non-union auto workers in Alabama. So let's keep a sense of perspective. And more to the point, Batya's belief that Trump's tariff policy will bring the jobs back really is a dispatch from an alternate dimension. Take 10 seconds to think about this one. If you're a capitalist who's considering building a domestic factory, you're supposed to, what? Just believe that the current tariff policy is going to last for the next 20 years and make a major investment on the basis of that belief? Come on, it's going to be different in 72 hours. But all the liberals pushing the same false dichotomy that Batya is, but with the pluses and minuses reversed, talking about tariffs as in themselves bad or wrong or economically illiterate thing to ever do, like this is just a tool of trade policy that should never, ever be used, are equally simplistic and wrong. And in a certain way, to be honest, actually disgust me more because of what they're showing about a lot of libs' contempt for blue-collar labor and total lack of understanding of any remotely plausible left-wing theory of change. A lot of this really came to the head when UAW President Sean Fain came out and said, wait, I don't like what Trump is doing either, but I actually do want there to be some tariffs, like on imported cars. And a lot of libs lost their minds, even though the UAW probably did more than any other union to try to beat Trump last fall. Fain was like, the most electrifying speaker at the DNC. Go on Twitter and do some searches, and you can find a zillion people yelling at him for muddying the waters of a simple anti-tariff message and therefore being, I don't know, a fascist collaborator or something. And by the way, I've seen some people claim that Fain was initially supportive of the Liberation Day nonsense and then, backed off, but that's actually wrong. That just gets the timeline wrong. When he came out and made a "yes, this is good, it's about time" message, it was when the specific auto tariffs were announced. As soon as Trump announced the sweeping so-called, reciprocal tariffs, right? That's the Liberation Day stuff. Fain immediately said, no, I'm not on board with that. So let's get the facts straight. But the bigger point is that all of these libs were essentially going from a correct opposition to what Trump is doing to basically overcorrecting all the way to apologetics for the global free trade regime that deindustrialized the region of the country I'm from, and thus gave us everything from the opioid crisis to the election of Donald Trump, and was just a body blow to the negotiating power of the biggest industrial unions that are still some of the largest and most strategically important parts of the American workers' movement, even in 2025. And to be really clear about this, it's not just a question of getting back jobs that have already been lost, or even just a question of saving jobs that haven't been lost yet. It's also, again, a question of negotiating power. The UAW has a lot less negotiating power when the auto companies can hold over their heads the threat to move operations and thus use that threat to help negotiate ever weaker and weaker contracts, which has happened a bunch of times. And this is really a life or death issue right now in 2025 for these workers, because ever since the success of the stand-up strike, especially, and those historic contracts, the auto companies have been pretty openly ramping up dual capacity production in the US and Mexico, specifically with the goal of weakening the threat to manufacturing from future auto worker strikes. And I want to say a couple of things about specific talking points that I've seen people raise when they want to lather some kind of veneer of sophistication onto just reverting to Clintonian free traderism. Like, there's this graph that was everywhere for a while last week that's supposed to show, see, the free trade deals, the China check, none of that had anything to do with deindustrialization. It's all a big myth. Really, it's 100% automation and 0% trade policy, because look, this graph that you're looking at is supposed to show a steady linear decline in manufacturing since World War II. And it's funny, the first time I heard this chart described was actually a few days before Liberation Day. So a couple weeks ago, I flew to New York to do this debate with this guy from the Manhattan Institute. If you don't know what that is, it's like a right-wing think tank. Whatever. The debate happened at like 9 a.m. New York time, which was 6 a.m. for my West Coast acclimated brain. And I had to wake up a good bit earlier than that to do it after barely sleeping. So I don't think this was exactly one of my top 10 debate performances. But whatever, when it comes out, we'll show you guys here and you can judge for yourselves. But the reason I'm bringing this up is that at the beginning, the moderator asked me to describe my personal experience, the way any personal experiences I may have had contributed to my current politics. And I talked a bit about growing up in the Rust Belt when, deindustrialization was ravaging it. And I mentioned something about free trade policies as part of that. And the Manhattan Institute guy said, no, that's not true. There's this graph, showing that it's a steady, constant decline since World War II. And at the time, I had no idea what the hell he was talking about, but I was fairly confident that that was wrong. And then, of course, after Liberation Day, that graph was everywhere. So I started to be like, that was what he was talking about. It was pretty inescapable in online lib discourse for a minute. But if you look at it carefully, let's look at it one more time, right? If you look at it carefully, you can see the trick, because this is a graph of manufacturing, as you can see at the top, a share of total employment. but it should take about 5 seconds of reflection to see all the ways that might be misleading. If manufacturing is holding steady, right, like there's exactly as much manufacturing as there were, while other sectors of the economy are being born or growing, or even just growing faster than manufacturing, the result of that will be that manufacturing will decline as a share of employment, right? Hell, manufacturing jobs could be growing and the share would still be declining if it's growing at a slower rate than the general population is growing. If, I don't know, there were decades where some sort of, let's call it a baby boom, was going on. And in fact, I saw Matt Huber post the second graph. We've got this one too, that is way more informative. This one shows you the absolute number of manufacturing jobs during the same period. And lo and behold, right, it dips up and down, of course, but like the overall trend is actually an increase from World War II. It hits an absolute peak at the end of the 1970s, and then it craters. So it's not that automation had nothing to do with it. Of course it did, but come on. Free trade is obviously part of this story. And by the way, I've also been seeing, including from some people I normally respect, some absolutely toxic garbage about how, all this nostalgia for, manufacturing jobs reflects a regressive patriarchal worldview because those were jobs where, people missed them because single providers could bring home the bacon while their wives stayed at home. And, so this is the bad gender politics that's behind all of this. Which is like, my God, what are we even doing here? Obviously, as an egalitarian leftist, I don't want any gender-based pressure on anyone to stay home if they don't want to. But for God's sake, the problem with that wasn't that the wages were high enough to support it. Right? That part was good. Couples with children should be able to figure out their work and child rearing arrangements however the hell they want to, whether it's both of them working in daycare. And of course, we should have free daycare to facilitate people who want to do that, or one working and one staying home, either the whole time or, alternating, for different periods of the kids, childhoods, or, both working part-time so they can spend more time with the kids or whatever, right? That's their business. In fact, you see way more of those kinds of arrangements in Nordic social democracies where people have more of an economic option to do it. There's nothing bad or anti-feminist about that. And the idea that there is, Jesus, that's some 2016 Hillary Clinton-ass nonsense. Similarly, for the idea I've seen floating around that deindustrialized worries are somehow about like specifically white nostalgia that's like racialized. No, motherfuckers. In the region I'm from, deindustrialization hit the non-white working class disproportionately harder than the white working class. Who do you think lives in Detroit? Who do you think lives in Flint or Milwaukee, where Malaika Jabali was writing about in her indispensable current affairs article several years back? I think we also have this graphic that was called the Color of Economic Anxiety, where she showed the role of disgust at the Clintons from the black working class in Milwaukee and Hillary losing Wisconsin in 2016. I've also seen people say, why are we so concerned about saving the industrial jobs that are still left? Most of them have gone away anyway. Look to the future. Let's focus on other things. And then, the people who think they're doing the sophisticated leftist version of this take will start rattling off this wish list of other goals they think are more important than saving industrial jobs, or again, shoring up bargaining power for people who do still have those jobs when, it's, contract negotiated time. I say, no, we shouldn't focus on that. We should be focusing on, these other goals, on getting the PRO Act or anti-scabbing laws, or just, pushing to unionize service workers or tech workers, or, even stuff like, sectoral bargaining or co-determination. And look, obviously, I want every single one of those things, every item on that list. But the weaker the labor movement is, right, the less likely that we are to be able to achieve any of the more ambitious long-term goals on these lists. And the easier it is for companies to jump from country to country in search of lower wages and more submissive workforces, the weaker the labor movement we've already got will be. The neoliberal global free trade regime was built for exactly that purpose, to weaken the institutional strength of the working class. And I've even seen people who think they're doing sophisticated leftist version of the lib, anti-tariff take say, ooh, you must not believe in international working class solidarity if you agree with Sean Fain about wanting some targeted tariffs to bolster the bargaining power of industrial unions. You must be an economic nationalist who just cares about, American jobs for American workers and screw the rest of the world. And I hope it's obvious why that's an absurd false dichotomy. You don't have to be an economic nationalist to think that the entire international working class is worse off given a global trade regime that's designed to grease the skids of capital mobility, to make it maximally easy for capital to move from country to country in search of more desperate workers who will put up with more. If a country moves from, if a company moves a factory from country A to country B, that might be a short-term benefit for workers in country B, but long-term, they're worse off too, because capital will have the same leverage over them when it's their turn. If the country B workers get too uppity and start demanding more, they can be disciplined with a threat that the factory will move to country C. The global race to the bottom is bad for workers in the US, certainly, but it's also bad for workers in Canada, workers in Mexico, workers in Japan, workers in China, those Vietnamese peasants that, who might become workers that Benny Johnson is talking about. It's worse for all of them. Sean Fain is very obviously right here. And if you're so committed to seeing everything through the prism of always say the opposite of what Trump says, that you can't see it, you've lost the plot. This really is walking at a very leisurely pace while chewing not even that much bubble gum. Look, Trump is pretty much always wrong. That premise is not incorrect. But that doesn't make the opposite of what he says always right. And if you want to defeat Trumpism, you need a compelling alternate vision of what society should look like along the lines that are suggested by that no kings, no oligarchy sign. And a retreat to the free trade politics of the 1990s is not it.
All right. Well said. Well argued, Ben. And with that, I think we have one more plug before we get to the main event, which is the pre-record for the event coming up in, I want to say San Francisco. Is that right?
Yes, San Francisco in 3 days from now. If you're watching this live on YouTube, if you're listening to it as a podcast, I'm sorry, this is probably in the past already. But if you're watching this on YouTube live, this is in 3 days. So on Thursday, April 17th, a little less than 72 hours from now, the great Jason Miles from This Is Revolution and I are going to be doing a live podcast at the El Rio in San Francisco on Is Trump the End of History? You'll probably hear some overlap to some of the subjects that we've discussed today in that. And I'm really looking forward to this. I've done, let's see, at this point, I feel like I've done maybe 4 live things with Jason at various times. We did the big New York and LA live shows with, that was like us, This Is Revolution, Left Reckoning, and we had like a bunch of other guests. Those were kind of like variety shows. I've also, we also both had books that came out where we, did like live book launch events and recorded them. And it's always a blast. I mean, it's just, look, everything is more fun when you're doing it in real life. And I say that as somebody who spends 99% of my working life on the computer, but everything is always more fun when you do it in real life. It's just a different atmosphere. It's a different feeling. I have, I don't know. I guess I'm thinking about, Andy keeps telling me about all these like stories about concerts he's been going to lately. And it's like, I keep, it's like, look, I spent a lot of time listening to Spotify, listening to rock music on Spotify on my Google Home device, but like actually going to a concert is still cool, right? Like, it's like, yeah, I like listening to podcasts, but and I like doing podcasts on my computer, but like doing it live is an entirely different beast. And yeah, this is a very different kind of thing from those big those sort of big scale live shows that we've done with, Matt Leck and David Griscom, and again, various guests in New York and LA. I mean, this is a more intimate thing. I would imagine there's going to be a fair amount of, like fucking around with people in the audience and, and all of this stuff. And I'm really looking forward to it. Right. I mean, this is going to be the highlight of my month. So yeah, we do have a ticket link. I did remember this time when I set up this episode. So we do have a ticket link down below the square we're watching us right now, for anybody who wants to snap up a last minute ticket to come see us in San Francisco on Thursday.
All right. And with that, we are going to play the main event, which is a pre-record, but from earlier today. So it's fresh. Talking to Matt Bruenig and Luke Savage about abundance. So we're going to play that and we'll see you after.
All right. I am now joined by two people who've both been on the show before, Matt Bruenig and Luke Savage, who have both written reviews of this book, Abundance, by Ezra Klein and Derek Thompson. And I think basically if you have, if you've been on, I guess, a certain kind of political Twitter in the last month, this like discourse about this book was pretty inescapable for a while, and for a long time I was kind of confused about why, right? Like if this is like, to the extent that this is like a sort of book about why liberals should care more about zoning reform and stuff, that doesn't seem like it would necessarily inspire it. But both of you wrote interesting things about this that, kind of helped me see that there's a broader set of interesting issues here. So Matt wrote this one at the People's Policy Project called The Abundance Agenda, and Luke wrote one called The Paucity of Abundance. And so I guess just to sort of catch up anybody who has managed to escape this, Luke, do you want to just kind of start us off with like a general sense of like what this book is about, like what the deal is, what Klein and Thompson are trying to get people to care about?
Sure. Part of the reason I wanted to write about it and why I actually took time to read the book is because I really could not discern from, just what was kind of floating around in the discourse, what exactly people were getting so worked up about in either direction. I couldn't understand why a book that seemed to be about, municipal zoning reform and that kind of thing was generating so much discourse. And I decided that I needed to find out. So, basically the sort of ambient impression that you might have from what is, from what you've seen floating around on Twitter and elsewhere is correct, right? The book's kind of basic thrusts are just that there are various administrative and regulatory costs associated with housing especially, but also with other things like transportation infrastructure and energy and so on. There's a similar kind of, in the second half, it gets into kind of similar ideas around there being too much risk aversion in how scientific research is conducted and innovation and that sort of thing. And there's sort of this, I guess, other narrative or this structuring narrative that there is a scarcity mindset that has captured the left of American politics, and what they mean by the left is itself kind of an interesting question to explore, but also the right. So this is ostensibly a supply side liberalism that they're offering us. And the thing that makes the book kind of strange is that it begins with this grand utopian sketch of the future. And so for me, there was just something inherently quite interesting about like how disparate these two poles are. On the one hand, you've got the minimalism of zoning reform and such, and you have a story about American politics that sounds quite third way-ish and just sounds like, we need to deregulate things and remove constraints from private economic actors and so on. And then on the other hand, it's like, but if we do that, if Cleveland has better zoning reform or zoning laws or whatever, we're gonna live in the Jetsons by 2050. So that's a broad sketch of the book.
Yeah. So Matt, you said in your review, right, that you kind of talk about the sort of main policy argument being, like Luke was saying, about administrative burdens on construction, and then there's the sort of secondary argument about innovation and science research. And you write, the authors seem to think these two arguments, the dozens of sub-arguments following them, all fit together because they relate back to abundance, a word that just means growth and innovation. But lots of problems relate back to growth and innovation, but that does not mean they all avail themselves of similar analysis and solutions. Of course, if you treat various policy topics as separate issues requiring their own specifically tailored technocratic solutions, you don't really have a book. You have a list of discrete proposals that could make up one section of Project 2029 white paper, but don't amount to a political manifesto.
Yeah, and I think that's where the kind of discourse, in some ways clumsily, in other ways more, cleverly, that's really where people are jumping off. That's where all the heat is, if you will. The specifics of the proposals are kind of here nor there. It's like, okay, fine. You want to make it to, like, one of the proposals is we want more early career scientists to get grant funding.
Yeah.
Okay, sure. Why not? So but when it then becomes this thing, like Luke was saying, that this is actually about the scarcity mindset of people like Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump, and we need to break through all of that. Then you start asking yourself, well, wait a minute, what do you mean break through all of that? If you don't like what Bernie was doing, what aspects of Bernie do you not like? And are we really going to abandon those things? And so what I kind of read out of this, it's kind of hard to pull it out perfectly because it's not like they have a paragraph where they're like, here are all the agendas that we want to put to the side and really focus on growth and innovation. It's just sort of sprinkled throughout. And of course, as I'm reading it, I'm always looking at, like, what about the welfare state? What about the welfare state? That's sort of one of the main tent poles of all left liberal politics for forever and ever, right? Going back 100+ years, right? So is that one of the things you think we're focused too much on? And I think that they basically suggest that it is. I have this quote in my piece where they say, for decades, American liberalism has measured its successes in how near it could come to the social welfare system of Denmark. And then, we need a liberalism that builds. And I think it's a mistake. I think we should maintain our interest in the welfare state, and it's if not centrality, close to centrality, in our project.
Yeah, I mean, this is something you both highlighted, and I mean, Luke, you've sort of written extensively over the years about, like, what the last few decades of American liberalism have been like. So, just mother of all softball questions, but I mean, is it your impression that American liberalism has tended over the last few decades to measure its success by how closely it approximates Nordic social democracy?
I mean, it's baffling, right? What's happening here is baffling, and as with so many of the kind of narratives that structure this book, they're quite evasive about what it is they're actually saying, both in the sense that Matt just described, where there's no paragraph where they say we reject redistribution. They do have some negative language about redistribution, where they sort of say, like, they describe it in, I think, quite conservative terms as a parceling out of the present.
Yeah.
We can't redistribute what we don't have, et cetera, which I think is an incorrect view of what redistribution is. But because I happen to think, there are no panaceas in politics, but economic redistribution is about as close to a panacea solution for many big political and social questions as exists. But no, I mean, this is baffling. And there are other places where they, I think there are similar sleights of hand. it seems to me it's quite the opposite. American liberalism has, in some ways, always been distinct from, the kind of welfarism that we've seen in, like Northern and Central Europe. But since the 1980s and 90s, right, it seems to me that American liberalism has defined itself precisely in opposition to like the universality that's so central to Nordic social democracy, to decommodification, right? Because so much of what the Nordic model is about is taking things out of the market entirely. But there's another very telling paragraph I'll just quote from here, where it seems to me when they're describing the welfare state, either they are deliberately and willfully misrepresenting what the social democratic welfare model is, or they just literally don't understand it. I'm curious what Matt thinks about that. But they write, progressives' promises and policies for decades were built around giving people money or money-like vouchers to go out and buy something that the market was producing, but that the poor could not afford. The ACA subsidizes insurance that people can use to pay for healthcare. Food stamps give people money for food, housing vouchers, tax credits for childcare, Social Security, and so on. The minimum wage and the earned income tax credit give them more money for anything they want, et cetera, et cetera. Again, that's not Nordic welfarism. And it seems to me that in sort of conflating and seeming to conflate Scandinavian social democracy with what is essentially the Clinton/Obama, approach of means testing everything and subsidizing the private market rather than replacing it with public goods and universal programs. It seems my reading of that was that they're just sort of, there's a sleight of hand going on here where they've just found an oblique way to make the normal, the familiar centrist critique of social democracy.
Yeah, I agree. And I think, it's funny. It's true, of course, that the other pillars of what goes into sort of Nordic welfare politics, they are missing entirely, right? It is redistributive, yes, but then it does A, B, and C as well. It creates, like you say, these universal programs. It pulls things out of the market. It creates certain entitlements that are separate from the market. It gives people power in the workplace because they have alternative income options. All that is just whatever. They miss all that. And it's just sort of like, what literally is happening? Some money is getting moved around. We kind of did that too. But I think the other thing that's going on here is they really want to try to draw a distinction between, increasing supply and changing distribution, and to sort of view those things as at odds with one another. And so, or another way to put it is, because I think that section you're talking about, they kind of go on to say that, this is sort of just kind of stoking demand, right? So the libs and the left, they're so focused on giving people money so that they can go do demand. But actually what we need is supply. Because if you give people money to demand, that a voucher to nowhere if you don't have supply, and like they're kind of playing with supply and demand, right? And I would rephrase it as like production and distribution, and that might be a cleaner way to think about it. Like you have certain ideas about how we should change production, and that's all well and good. It's kind of different and separate altogether from the question of distribution. Because the question of distribution is not just, as they say, parceling out the present, in which we imagine like we have sort of like an existing set of widgets and trinkets, and we're all just kind of moving them around. It's about structuring how distribution will occur now and in the future, right? How is the production that you want to achieve, how is it going to go out to people? In what proportion? In at what levels of inequality? That's what the welfare state and other, institutions in, this sort of egalitarian playbook does. And so to present that as like, well, all redistribution could be about is the present. Like, no, like we have new stuff to distribute all the time. And your whole thing is you're going to create more new stuff to distribute. So there's still the question of to whom and in what quantities. And to say that we can kind of put that aside is like, well, then what is even the point of the production? Let's say we produced all the cool stuff you wanted to produce, but only gave it to one person. Have we achieved something? Not to reduce it all the way to like that kind of absurd a thing, but it starts to get your mind going on why actually, to achieve their own goals, they need to think about distribution.
Yeah, I mean, I think that one thing that I was really really surprised by, right, is there are a couple paragraphs where they're talking about Karl Marx, getting into to my interests. They say comparatively, abundance is returned to an older tradition of leftist thought. In the Communist Manifesto, Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels acknowledged that capitalism was superior to its predecessor, feudalism, in producing goods and wealth. And they quote the Communist Manifesto on the sort of wonders that have been wrought by capitalism. They did not want to end this revolution in production. They wanted to accelerate it, just as feudalism blocked production that only capitalism could unleash. So did capitalism constrain an abundance that a new paradigm might really unleash. I think that's the only time I've ever heard that referred to as new paradigm. I like it. Core to this analysis of the economy was an idea that's come to be called the fettering of production. Marx observed that many companies' obsession with profit kept the entire economy from exploring ideas that threatened incumbent margins or failed to produce immediate returns. Among capitalism's many sins, Marx wrote, was that it prevented the most wondrous and useful technology from being invented and deployed in the first place. An economy run amok with useless fettering serves the rich few at the expense of the poor many. Marx's aim was not to return the abundance machine off, but to direct its ends towards a shared abundance, to unburden the forces of production and make possible what would have been impossible to imagine. There's much he got wrong, but one need not be a communist to see the wisdom in this analysis. And I've got to say, this is just like the strangest description of like what Marx sort of thinks about the progressive achievements of capitalism that I've ever heard, because other than that one word shared that's sort of smuggled in there, right? Like it's like even Karl Marx in this telling, like it's like they present it as if his only objection to capitalism was that it didn't produce enough stuff, right? Like not that like, oh look, on the one hand, capitalism has created this tremendous productive capacity, and on the other hand, the working class majority, doesn't benefit from it in the way that they should because of the way property relations, are structured. I mean, it's like, it is sort of remarkably strange, because I think usually the sort of like a sort of simplification of Marx would be the other way around, right? That's like all he cares about is distribution.
Yeah.
But it's like, look, I mean, so clearly Marx does care quite a bit about distribution.
I think they're conflating. I mean, oh my God, well, they're not to be too obvious here, but they're conflating the sort of like dialectical materialist like predictions about how this is going to go with a sort of his normative politics, which, I mean, I know like that's kind of sort of the whole thing the Marxists get very touchy about, is that you don't conflate those two things. But I kind of blipped over that part of the book. I was actually at the playground with my child when it was reading it, and I was like, oh, whatever. We're at the end here. Let's just power through. But it is funny because there is a way in which you could say, hey, what is Marx pointing out here? He's pointing out that capitalism contains within it certain kinds of contradictory institutions that will end up fettering production. And, you could start from there and be like, how would I write a book that is about this topic from that perspective? And some of it might be overlapping. You could be like, very interesting. So we create this personal private asset in ownership of land and space and structures. And lo and behold, people, because of the creation of that institution with a uniquely capitalist kind of concept, and it becomes fully marketized. Not just I live in my house, I worry about the number, the dollar amount that the house moves. Or I can actually now go on Zillow and see a chart of my house's value as if it's like a stock ticker. And the people in that situation now are like, don't build the new rail line by my house. Don't build the new energy facility. In fact, don't build an apartment, because they're trying to defend the property institutions. And so, yes, like there's such an inherent, problem here. And then of course, be like, so then Marx will say, well, then that's going to have to give away to a more socialized approach, right? You could go there, and like but they don't, obviously. The fact that, hey, we're going to have to figure out what are we going to do with the fact that our property relations is what is fettering, in their own telling, the creation of all this extra production. And we may need to tackle that, move in a whole other different way to think about property and homes and whatever. It's like, no, just tweak that zoning reform, and then we solve the thing that Marx didn't like, which was the fettering of production.
This flourish about Marx, I mean, this is intellectually lazy to an extent that if you put this on an undergraduate essay, I feel like you'd be called out by a TA or prof who is marking it, because what they're essentially saying here is oh, you lefties, in the tradition of Karl Marx, think that Marx and Engels were against the production of more stuff, and we're here to tell you that we're the true heirs to Marx and Engels because we like stuff, unlike you people afflicted with the scarcity mindset. Like, this is so stupid. It makes me think of, it's like those things from like Billionaire magazine where it'll be a meme with, I don't know, Martin Luther King, or I don't know if they've done Debs yet, but then it'll have a quote that's just like a success win quote that could just as easily have come from Andrew Carnegie or something. Yeah. That's kind of the level of analysis we're dealing with
over
here.
A super yacht.
Yeah, exactly. Like, this is worthy of a Tom Friedman column or something. It's ridiculous.
Yeah, so I think as silly as that Marx flourish is, I mean, it's kind of worth pointing out because it might say something about the sort of like monomaniacal focus on production as the only thing that matters. Because, like, Matt, something you pointed out in your review, I like this point, is that normally you'd be very unsympathetic to somebody who was like mad at a book because of what wasn't in it, right? Mm-hmm. That like it's like somebody writes a book about zoning reform, and you're like, oh, why aren't you talking about Medicare for all? It's like normally that'd be a very silly criticism, right? Because it's like, wow, that's just a different book, right? Like, what are you complaining about? But in this case, the way that they frame it actually does make that a legitimate criticism, because it is very explicitly not just like, oh, here are some interesting problems and here are some solutions to the sort of particular problems that we're concerned with, but it is very explicitly framed as a sort of manifesto for what kind of liberalism we need, what that liberalism should be focused on, and so given that, I mean, it's like, look, if you're making this grand argument about priorities, then suddenly all that stuff is actually on the table, right? That it's like, no, it's if you're deprioritizing redistribution of wealth, for example, because that's just the parceling out of the present, and we should be focusing on an abundant future, right? Then it actually does become a relevant criticism. It's like, no, actually, parceling out the present or future is actually really important.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, another way to think about it is almost like different levels of analysis. So you think about people have kind of like a philosophical framework worldview. Maybe under there you could think of like an intermediate thing that involves the population of certain policy goals that like relate back to the philosophical framework, and then you've got like policy particulars, like how do we go at those goals. So you can kind of think about those three levels. And when I started to read the book, it seems like I read it for the same reason Luke did, because I saw all this stuff and I was like, what's going on here? Is this because it just seems like, okay, some policy particulars, here's how we achieve the here's how we achieve the carbon-free future. Okay, well, whatever. You've got your view on it. Someone else has some other view. Whatever. That could be interesting. That could be fun. I don't know why everyone's so pissed off about it. But then you see, oh, no. They're not just operating on the policy particular level. They're at least on the policy goal level, and at times at the like philosophical framework level, and but very poorly. And so if you're starting to dip your toe at those levels, then now that opens up the whole terrain for people to be like, well, no. If this is going to be your philosophical outlook, that's wrong. It's got to be this one. And if this is going to be the policy goal, the set of policy goals that are, supreme over all others, well, now we need to talk about all these other goals that are implicitly not supreme. And so they, in a sort of lawyer sense, open the door, and now everyone is coming in. And so once I read the book, I was like, okay, I get it. I see where people are headed with it. And yeah, I think it's. I don't think they do a very good job on that part, but like you said at the very beginning, it's kind of like the book is really only interesting if you bring in that part. If you don't bring in that part, it's almost not even a book. It's like a white paper.
Yeah, there's a writer on Substack, Joe Mile, who he kind of speculates, and I think this is pretty reasonable speculation, that this book, a lot of which is cribbed directly from columns that Thompson and Klein wrote. I've been writing, I think, since 2021 or 2022. That they kind of wrote it assuming that there was going to be another Democratic presidency, so either another Biden term or a Kamala Harris one. And so, they may have had to kind of quite suddenly affix this much grander story to it, both in terms of, positioning it as an agenda, as like a new agenda for the Democratic Party. Like, this is how we win back power. And, of course, they're now doing that at a time when the populist left, not the kind of centrist wonks, are leading the resistance to Donald Trump. They're positioning the book, and they do this explicitly in the conclusion, right? They position it as both an alternative to the Trumpian right and to the populist left, but also in kind of the second portion, or in how the book opens as well, in the introduction, with all the stuff about with the sort of quasi-futurist gloss they give to everything. That also kind of seems to me, or one way of reading it certainly, is that that's an attempt to win back the sort of, the Silicon Valley types who've kind of moved to the right, or who've moved from the Democratic Party to the Republican Party. It might have been one of you who said this, actually, but that, there's a sort of, it's designed to capture refugees from the effective altruist movement. So I think, yeah, like as you said, Matt, like there's not really a book, except in this kind of meta sense that they've like stitched all these disparate things together. And I guess, to their credit, I'm sure this will be a very successful airport book. I think it's on the New York Times bestseller list, but it is not any kind of cohesive whole, and it's not very intellectually coherent. So you really have no choice but to read around it and to read into the blank space. And I really think most of what's up for debate about this book has to do with just how cynical do we ultimately think they're being. I think there are certain places where the book's omissions seem so glaring that they have to be deliberate. Like there's a calculus to them that I think is quite cynical. And there's other places, I mean, I'm genuinely puzzled by their attitude towards the welfare state. And I am open to the idea, that perhaps like they're so immersed in sort of like centrist wonk discourse that they really think the welfare state is just giving people money. I don't know.
The one other thing I'd add here is, and this is I guess goes to the sort of like reading through the blanks and the omissions, and like what is structuring this, and what could be upsetting people about this. Because I saw this when I read all the reviews that I could. I read like 12 of them before I wrote my piece, and I stumble upon, this is like not just a book. It's apparently it's a whole thing with like, I mean, literally. One of them I saw was over 100 million. Open Philanthropy, which is a like effective altruist kind of entity, announcing a $120 million abundance fund. And there's like 5 or 6 new NGOs that have like abundance in their name. And now I'm seeing like abundance conferences. I think there's an abundance conference in DC I got an email about recently. It's a whole thing. Like, it's not just, these two guys were writing some articles that were kind of similar, overlapped in some ways, and we're like, why don't we do a book, make some money? It's like it's a big, like, it's a legit movement, if you will. I guess you would call it like an AstroTurf or capital G groups style movement, but it's definitely a thing that's moving, and they're trying to make an impact. And Jared Polis is endorsing it, and they're racking up, if you will, kind of political wins in the way that like a think tank or other kind of NGO funded style like movement might be, trying to move and operate through the system.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'm slightly curious about this. I mean, what does an abundance NGO do? Right? I mean, like.
Well, you fund white papers and conferences, and you have experts that can give quotes in media hits and will help. Because remember, no politician has staff that can actually do anything. I love their staff, but like they're so overloaded and they don't have any money, so all that's outsourced. I don't know. I think about it from a think tank perspective, and the amount of like bills and whatever that I've had to help write and stuff over the years, like all that gets pushed out to someone or other who's, and if you can get your money lined up behind it, it's how the what do they say, how the sausage is made, kind of thing.
Yeah, so much of it seems to be about crafting a lexicon, crafting, a message box that I don't know, Democratic members of Congress who want to align themselves with the abundance agenda, and perhaps it's about creating incentives for those reps to align themselves with it as well. But it's about crafting a message box for them to use. So, people like Richie Torres have started talking about the abundance agenda. So I guess he has a second interest now, beyond his kind of main thing he focuses on. But there was that interview before I'd read Abundance. There was that interview that Ezra Klein did, and it was transcribed in the New York Times with that guy Jake Auchincloss, who's a congressman from Massachusetts. And I mean, I guess I don't know what Auchincloss is like when he's going door knocking, but it's pretty amazing if you read that interview, which is the most convoluted, just soup of like just arbitrary, like labyrinthine detail. But the point is he's learned all the, he's already learned all of the terms, and there's an infrastructure now, as you were saying, Matt, that like exists to train a congressman to talk that way. It's nonetheless pretty funny to imagine trying to sell that political style as any kind of popular agenda, because he's saying stuff the whole time like, oh, we need an economy of Legos instead of an economy of monopolies. And we should have an attention tax, which I read his shit about an attention tax, which is supposed to fund local journalism. I read those paragraphs like 5 times, and I still have no idea what he's talking about.
I assume that's like a levy on Facebook or TikTok or something to fund press subsidies.
Well, you read it and see if you can figure it out. It's inscrutable.
Yeah, I mean, so I guess one thing that does strike me, even about some of the proposals, and I do think like every sort of left or leftish critic I've seen of this book, I mean, you guys are like from the sort of anti-monopoly end of things, like Zephyr Teach Out or whatever, like everybody at some point will sort of say, yeah, look, a lot of these proposals are like fine, right? Like that's and and I can see that a lot of them are. I do think maybe this touches on some of the question about redistribution, because it does seem like even some of the zoning reform stuff, which is what people, I think will most often sort of say, yeah, sure, right, gonna do that, right? Like even some of that kind of feels like, oh, maybe we can like it's like okay to like have, we can like get rid of some of the restrictions on like building like apartments that like don't have windows or air filters or stuff. And it's like, and I think it's a small example, but it might say something about this sort of lack of interest in parceling out the present or future. Because it's like, well, hold on, is that abundance? I mean, it's kind of like you're saying like, I mean, that's actually like, the like sort of individual pieces we're parceling out to people are actually going to be smaller, right? But like, don't worry, but like you're just going to make it easier to parcel out, right? I mean, that seems very unabundant for the people at the bottom.
Yeah, I saw a really funny example of this. When one of the things they fixate on the book is this housing development in San Francisco, I think it was, and they spent a lot of time on it. And what was kind of clever about it or interesting about it is it was very affordable, or the amount of money it took per unit was a lot lower. Like, I don't know, 200 grand a unit or 300 or something. It was a lot lower than normal. And the only way they were able to accomplish that was because they did all private money, and they did all these things to avoid the state being involved at all, therefore not triggering all these rules that you had to follow, and forms and reviews and all this kind of stuff. And I was like, okay, that's a compelling example, certainly, of administrative burden. Okay, yeah, and it is kind of sad that like you'd have to use all private money to do that. Like, shouldn't the state, be able to be more efficient once it's involved, because it's both the funder and the approver and all that? And then I went on Twitter and I just saw someone share, and they were like, this is the thing they're talking about. And they showed it, and it was like this, the units were look like prison cells. They were so tiny. And they were like these studios. I don't know. It just was like, it was like a micro apartment, and hey, I'm not against it, whatever, but it's better than living on the street and all that. But it's like, that's, again, like you said, I was like, is that abundance? Is that, I don't know. It seems like these people are not getting a whole lot.
Well, and also it's a far cry from the actual portrait of abundance they offer
utopian
in the introduction.
Future, yeah.
Right, because they're talking about, oh, well, there's all this new space for housing because we built these skyscraper high like eggplant farms, these greenhouses that reach up to the heavens, and like we have orbital platforms that are, shipping free prescription drugs to people via drone all the time and stuff like that. And yeah, that is a pretty far cry from like single staircase apartment buildings with like that lead to little microscopic like 250 square foot units. Like, abundance is not the term that I would use for that.
Yeah, I mean, even if you think like it's one thing to say, all right, we're going to make like a utilitarian calculation here that we can like build a bunch of these like tiny cell apartments, and like that'll still be better, right? Than having less housing overall. It's like, okay, fine, right? Like I mean, I honestly, to me, that kind of seems like scarcity thinking. It's like I think maybe we can like find ways to like build things that are more livable than that. But like whatever. That's like an argument you could have, right? But like sort of calling that abundance does maybe say something about the sort of core conflation here. That's like when that as you said, Matt, I mean, like in your review, I mean, what they really seem to mean by abundance is growth and innovation, right? It's like, sure, those are good things, right? No denying that. But like, if you're going to have this grand vision of, like the implication of a lot of the way they talk about it seems like, when we think about abundance, we're thinking about sort of like unleashed, flourishing of life. And I think one, maybe going back to, this is something you hit on a lot in your review, Luke. I mean, like, this is that it's like, look, sort of wanting a more uninhibited flourishing of human life is precisely why the left has always cared about equality.
Yeah, I agree with that so hard. I'm not sure I have anything to add there.
Well, and I also think I mean, like you were saying with equality, but that example is also such a beautiful, link back to the whole issue with distribution, right? Because the case you make for those like micro apartments is you're like, well, if you look at like the 5th percentile, like it's either for the 5th percentile as it, exists in our society, what they are allotted, their sort of aggregate resource allotment, like they're either in a tent under the underpass or they could live here. And you're like, this is definitely a huge improvement. Like, don't get me wrong, but that kind of gets to the point, right? Which is like, if in the future the 5th percentile is still, at 10% of the average, it's gonna be not abundant for them. Certainly, it's gonna be kind of ugly for them. So it the fact that they never mentioned in the piece, I guess, in the book that that these are like little micro tiny apartments is just really tickled me in retrospect. It just really undermines so much, whether it's the utopian vision, whether it's a general sense of abundance, whether it's about the irrelevancy of redistribution, like all that really, it comes to the fore when you're like, oh, you're just putting these people in little shoeboxes.
Well, and we'd be remiss to not bring in the example that Ryan Grimm raised, which you've probably both seen, in response to the story that Klein told in a viral clip from Jon Stewart's show, where, he's talking about the Biden administration, passed this legislation to build rural broadband, and, they spent all this money and nothing happened. And as Ryan pointed out, what actually happened is there were carve-outs in the bill, and the people can easily find the clip if you want to get the details. But I'm just kind of truncating it here. But I mean, essentially, companies like Comcast, big telecom monopolies, got a bunch of carve-outs built into the bill because they didn't want to have to compete with public infrastructure. So what they tell is this story of the scarcity mindset in action, and of the cumbersome bureaucratic administrative state, just throwing money at the wall and nothing happening, even to get something very basic done, like build rural broadband. It's just actually a very familiar story of monopolism and corporate capture, and I suspect that's true of a bunch of the anecdotes and case studies they provide in this book. So this book is intellectually sloppy at the sort of macro conceptual level for all the ways we've been saying, but it also seems like they're quite sloppy at the level of wonk detail, which, like, if Ezra Klein can't get that right, that's kind of supposed to be his.
What's
his
the point
thing.
of Ezra Klein?
Exactly.
No, and I mean, I think there's a broader issue here, right? Which is like, okay, so we've been talking about the vision of the book and what might be left out of that, right? But like there's also the question of what they see as the obstacles to that vision, right? So I did see that Ryan Grimm clip you're talking about, Luke, and that's like a nice striking example, because it seems like I mean, I don't want to oversimplify, like they kind of name a few villains over the course of the book, but like one of the big villains they name is like Ralph Nader, that in this sort of really strange way, because like usually if you hear that guy's name invoked in a negative way, people are talking about like the 2000 election, and like a lot of liberals would be like, yeah, sure, before that, right? That's like the seatbelts, airbags, right? It's like Nader's great, right? But like the thing that they're mad about Ralph Nader for, like, is in fact all that stuff, right? The sort of consumer safety advocacy and lawsuits and all of that stuff, which they take as sort of emblematic of the sort of liberal do-gooder obstacles to abundant growth.
Yeah, I mean, can I just would like to table for discussion, like, the paragraph here where they offer sort of a backstory to this, because it's not just Ralph Nader. I mean, it's, again, they're very evasive about what it is they're actually saying here, and they seem to be saying simultaneously that there's this NIMBYist ethos that sort of comes out of the new left, and it comes out of Nader, and this kind of there's this individualist, selfish ethos, but then also there's this kind of centralizing, overly bureaucratizing one as well, which to me there's a bit of a tension there. But I mean, this backstory they provide, I mean, this is pop sociology, it's like they're very unclear and evasive about what it is they're actually saying. They say, in the 1970s, the New Deal order collapsed beneath the weight of crises it could not contain, stagflation in the Vietnam War most notably. But there was more to it than that. Abroad, the horrors and absurdities of communism became clearer. At home, millions of oppressed Americans marched, sat in, and organized for rights. A change in values took hold. The promise of collective action lost its luster, nurturing the dignity and genius of the individual in the face of regimes that seemed to squelch both became the reigning ethos. So that's how they're accounting for the decline of kind of the more communitarian style of liberalism, and kind of the fall of the New Deal, and The Great Society, which there's all kinds of problems with that, because those things were undone as part of a concerted political project, right? It's not like there wasn't just some sort of like diaphanous spiritual transformation that happened where people became more individualistic. So again, this just seems like a clear case of the book that, like, there's no political economy in this book, so it has to resort to stuff like this instead. But also, yeah, I mean, this is such a convoluted story they're telling here, and again, they're being very evasive about who the actual like who's actually responsible, who are the antagonists of this project. And I mean, there's different ways of reading that, but I suppose one of them is just centrist liberals have long had a kind of like reflexive aversion to the idea that there are antagonists in politics, right? Like they don't like politics to be structured around conflicts. It's one of the many things they disliked about Bernie Sanders. So yeah, I don't know. A lot could be said here, but it's just all of this is very convoluted to me.
Yeah, and it's a weird paragraph too, right? Because the one you started out with, because it's pairing this sort of like the problems with Soviet style communism and sort of people's reactions to that with it kind of sounded like the civil rights movement as like because that was sort of asserting rights against oppression, and like this all sort of leads to this individualist ethos, which is it just, I mean, maybe this is obvious, but I mean, it just seems like, well, there's a lot that's been shoved together there. I mean, like if it's not like the actual civil rights movement, like one of their big demands was like government job programs, right? Like, so that's not the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, right? Like that's so it's like just sort of said, oh yeah, well, people were concerned about like their rights in this situation, and they were concerned with people's rights in the Soviet Union, and that all kind of led to this ethos of individualism.
Yeah, I mean, and I this isn't what I was getting at in this part of my review, but you don't have to do this historical attempt. You really don't. And I feel like maybe they felt like they had to, and then they were like, oh my God, what do we do? It was some combination of Ralph Nader and the consumer movement, the environmentalist movement. I think what was it? Silent Stream. Is that Rachel Carson? Rachel Carson, is that her name?
Yeah.
Yeah. She was also did it. The New Left did it. Also, but I think maybe just like rich societies get a little bit more like deliberate in their decision making, a little more, people have more to lose, things become more developed, externalities become more clear, state capacity kind of develops more, so it becomes a little bit easier to kind of deliberate over these things. I included in my review Matt Iglesias' theory, which is that, because the left has become more kind of educated and more high end than it used to be, that they've taken on the attitudes of the English gentry, and like that's the cause. And like all these are all efforts to point, to try to somehow explain like this historical shift. And to me, I'm just like, why even do that? Just say, look, these rules are bad. We're going to fix them. Otherwise, because you just open yourself up to people like Luke just being like, what is this? This is so unclear. I don't know what's going on, and just being lampooned. Because like, if you were to try to actually answer this question, as a historian,
right?
Just, I mean, years of work, presumably. And then even then the book's probably like, God, I don't know, it's like 500 pages of a lot of hedging.
It occurs to me like one way of reading this book, you could do a Straussian reading, right? You could read this book as like they're writing, Thompson and Klein are writing esoterically. So all of the kind of evasions and the blank space is sort of deliberate. And I mean, if we consider again the passage that I just read, I mean, if you changed a few of the words around in that passage, if they describe the various like 1960s, the movements for rights of various kinds. I mean, they don't say it, but when they say millions of oppressed Americans marched and sat in, et cetera, I mean, they're talking about, the anti-war movement. They're talking about the feminist movement. They're talking about the civil rights movement. And if you kind of like read between the lines a little bit, and we're being perhaps a tad ungenerous to them, they are getting awfully close in that paragraph to what has long been one of the dominant right-wing narratives about the 1960s, right? Which is that in the 1960s, a series of these kind of irrational enthusiasms among the liberal class, feminism, Black liberation, civil rights, et cetera, that realizes itself by the 1970s by interest groups making demands on the state, making demands for resources, that kind of thing. And so that's why we need, neoliberalism. That's why we have to dismantle the regulatory state and the administrative state, because otherwise we're just going to have like a state that just funnels money because it's been captured by all these different interest groups, and we need a society of individuals, not groups, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, this is like getting close to something that Jordan Peterson could have said if you read it a certain way, which would be unfair to do if they were a little more precise, but they're so imprecise. It's certainly tempting to read it like that.
Well, I mean, I think that certainly the thing that actually does feel, and I think this is fair, Jordan Peterson-esque, is the sort of idea that it's like, look, what we should, again, what really matters is growth, right? Not the parceling, right? I mean, this is like, I think of Jordan Peterson in his debate with Slavoj Žižek, where he says, sort of says at the beginning, hey, I flipped through the Communist Manifesto, and I saw at the beginning that Marx admits that capitalism does a really good job of developing the forces of society, productive forces. So why not just keep with that, right? Because that's what matters. And I mean, I think a lot of the discussion has kind of floated around okay, they some of the stuff we were talking about earlier about that bizarre line about the Nordics, right? It is almost like, what you often hear from libertarians or conservatives, where they just not really making a distinction between Obamacare and universal public health insurance, or whatever. I mean, between the kinds of social benefits that exist in a place like Sweden, and sort of means tested public assistance programs of various kinds, and says, yeah, whatever, it's all kind of the same thing. Now, to be fair to them, the difference between them and people on the right who would do that are the people on the right would be like, yeah, that's all the same thing, and it's like socialism, and it's dangerous, and it's bad, right? Whereas they're like, yeah, we've basically been doing all that, and sure, whatever, that's good, right? Like that's we're all for that, whatever, it's fine, right? But then the whole thrust of the argument seems to be systematically de-emphasizing that, saying yeah, we've sort of liberalism has suffered from too great an emphasis on redistribution, which can, in the way a lot of Luke's work has over the years has documented, is sort of very unlike how we tend to perceive the last few decades of American liberalism. But I think it also gets back to the question Matt was raising a second ago, right? Which is okay, why are we interested in the historical narrative in the first place? Because sure, I mean, if all you're doing is sort of making policy proposals, right? You can't leave out the historical narrative. It's okay, whatever. Regardless of how the problem arose, here's the problem, and here's the policy. I think would fix the problem. But the one reason it might be important is if you think that not just in the past this is how it's arose, but it might be relevant to your story about what kind of forces stand in your way right now. And Matt, I thought one of the most striking things in your review was where you sort of said, hey, it's really strange to read Ezra Klein sort of promoting, what he at least sees as this very ambitious agenda. And there actually are ambitious things about it. I mean, there are things about what's been suggested that that there would be a lot of resistance to, right? And you were thinking back to this conversation you had with Klein in like 2019 or something about Medicare for all, and in that conversation, like it seemed like his big objection to Medicare for all was that it's like not politically practical because there'd be a lot of opposition.
Yeah. No, because Klein was a healthcare guy for so long. That's part of how he got to be such a big player, was during the Obamacare debates and all that. So, he knows a lot about healthcare, the health insurance system, without a doubt. That was a great podcast I had with him, but it was I didn't find it frustrating because I knew from the get-go that was what was going to be his move. When you're dealing with other kinds of people on healthcare, you don't necessarily know, like they might believe something like Medicare for all will bankrupt America, and you have to like wade through like that. It's like Ezra's been doing this for a long time. He's smart enough to know that like the move here is not Medicare for all bad. I can't do that. Certainly they're probably not against Matt. So we got to go politics. And it's like, all right, that's fine. But yeah, when I was reading the book, I just remember that so much because I'm just sitting here and be like, oh man, like the politics of this are rough. Like, so your main, to the extent that they identify a villain and they are careful about just kind of being real wishy-washy about it, it's got to be the American homeowner. The American homeowner has got to be the big main person who's holding back progress in the country. Like, okay, fine. So let's look up them. That's 2/3 of American adults, disproportionately older, disproportionately wealthier. Like as a share of voters, I don't even know. I'm sure you could find this. It's probably like 75% of voters or something, just because the way it skews demographically. And so we got this whole book, and we're going to take on 75% of the voting population and strip them of all this power they have to protect their assets and to determine, what kinds of things exist around them and, affect their quality of life and whatever. And that's my policy thing. And I'm just remembering back where he was when he asks me, so what are you going to do about like employer opposition to this? I'm like, well, we're going to have to take them on. And I'm like, that's like less than 1% of the population, it's like an employer. Like theoretically, yes, I think a mass movement could take on a small percentage of the population that employs people as like a business owner or whatever. And you're wanting to take on like the whole voting populace, essentially. It just seems at odds, but I think it, I don't know how much you want to read into it, but it's just people are very selective and they tend to be very blind. They see the political obstacles of things they don't really care that much about. And if they're really interested in it, they're maybe less prone to see the politics of it. Like the political practicality argument is very selectively applied. And certainly in this case.
You see this in all kinds of debates today, and not just about social programs and redistribution, because there is, like, on the one hand, we're constantly confronted in political discourse with the assertion that essentially nothing is possible. Like the United States, which is the richest, society in the history of civilization, cannot realize, universal health insurance, even though Canada, where I live, has had it since the 1960s and is a much poorer country. So we're told like nothing is possible in the public sphere. Programs that quite literally exist in the world, they have been realized. The United States cannot, American politics cannot achieve those things. But then in the private sphere, right, particularly out of Silicon Valley, we're constantly told that we're going to have like sentient computers that are going to do everything very soon. Elon Musk has been claiming for like nigh on 2 decades now that he's going to like establish a Martian colony, and he's always like 2 or 3 years away from launching the project. There's so many things like this. I think back to one of the Democratic debates in 2020 when, Biden, I think, I could be misremembering, but I think right after dismissing Medicare for all as improbable, he just said, well, I'm going to find a cure for cancer in my first term, So we're like, I think that's operating here as well. Like there's this kind of this this dissonance where, yeah, like as you said, Matt, like certain things based on people's subjective preferences are just deemed, or in some cases, like who's bankrolling them or other more material factors like that, like people are very selective about what they decide is intractable political opposition or not. And I mean, I think the point you just made about, they're taking on the American homeowner with this agenda is worth considering, because they might even be aware of that. But I don't think, I don't get the sense when you read the sections of this book that gesture at the idea that this is going to be a political agenda, that they really care about that sort of opposition. I think, I don't know, I'm not as familiar with Derek Thompson's work, but it seems to me Ezra Klein is someone who largely, well, I mean, it kind of considers politics as, to be an elite concern. And he imagines this is something that's played out in kind of elite think tanks and in kind of other elite spaces. And so if you're taking on 75% of the electorate, that's not a problem, but taking on, the health insurance industry is, because
right.
those aren't the kinds of people you go up against. I mean, they do quote this political scientist, is it Gary Gersel, who talks about how, the things you need for a successful, a successful agenda is, you need to make advances across a broad front. You need deep-pocketed donors, think tanks, policy networks, candidates, an inspiring moral message. And they mention both Reagan and FDR as kind of examples of doing this. But there's nothing about, you need a mass movement. You need to mobilize people. You need to you need to organize popular pressure to exert, to make demands on political institutions or anything like that. So yeah, once again, I think there's a lot that one can kind of learn about the worldview of this book just from looking at the blank space and the things that they don't address.
Yeah, they definitely do have a grass tops theory of change, which, if you've been in DC your whole life, I'm sure that's what you think of it. But yeah, I guess that is a very good point. When he said, how do you overcome the employers, he really meant the Chamber of Commerce and the various lobbying organizations. And I don't know, is there a homeowner version of that? I'd probably not. It's like those are just people, but I'm talking about the institutions that determine what policy is viable or not. That's a funny. And the utopian thing is I don't know why I thought of this just now, but there's a one of the things I really like about the early socialists is they really do this thing where they're like, one of their arguments against, clearly, they're dealing with people who are saying, you can't do this, you can't achieve socialism. And one of the things they'll point to is scientific progress. And they'll be like, if we can do this, then this is nothing, And it's funny because they're writing 1830 or whatever. And so what they think of as scientific progress is it's impressive. Don't get me wrong. But there's no well, if we can land a man on the moon, then it's so much lower tier stuff. But obviously it's very impressive to them in that moment.
Yeah.
And I think about this in the context of this book, where it's okay, so and then that discussion with Ezra, it's so Ezra is we can have orbital pharmacies that shoot Ozempic down to homes. But if you're can we get everyone on a single public health insurance plan? He's absolutely not. It's a full inversion. And you can, it's wait a minute. Surely if we can have orbital pharmacies, which is a medical thing, we can make sure everyone has health insurance, right? It's no, it's too much. But yeah, it does go to show you it's sort of but I mean, that gets to the point of I don't know, how much is technology the thing that holds us back, or growth the thing that holds us back? It's this other constellation of things that, ideology, philosophies, vested interests and stuff.
Again, the parceling out does seem very relevant. I think there was this thing that was going around a few weeks ago about Bill Gates saying that by whatever year in the future, we won't need humans to do most things. And then he was so we'll have therefore we'll have a 25-hour work week. It's well, that's a really weird therefore, because work week hasn't gone down since the Fair Labor Standards Act in 1938. And there's been a lot of technological progress since 1938, right? That's clearly not the holdup. But I really like your point about strategy and the contrast to employer opposition to Medicare for all and homeowner opposition to a lot of the sort of YIMBYist stuff that they're focused on. Because in a way, I mean, it's like, okay, look, I certainly don't want to like understate how hard it is to overcome employer opposition, because it's one might be 1% of the population, but it's like 1% of the population with like an enormous amount of political power. But like also, if you're going to have ambitious goals that require you to overcome all sorts of vested political opposition, then it seems like you need to be able to have a popular movement that can gain majority support, right? I mean, like as kind of the baseline, in a democracy, or at the very least, if that's not part of the plan, right? Like I want to know what the plan B is, and so like in a certain sense, it sort of reminds me of like the Adolf Reed argument about reparations, where it'll be like, okay, it's like if we're just doing a normative thing, would it be nice to have reparations? Sure, right? But like if you're trying to achieve any sort of major redistribution of wealth, right? Like then you have to overcome all these vested interests. You're going to be able to do that much more easily if you're doing it in a way that's going to benefit a majority of the population, right? Rather than only benefiting a minority of the population. And the problem with like homeowner opposition to zoning reform, or to like even stuff that's like, I mean, I think like even the sort of most unambiguously positive aspects of the abundance agenda, like I'd love high-speed rail all over the place. That'd be amazing, right? They like it, you have to be able to do it in a way, presumably, that would clearly benefit, right, the majority of the population. And so there's a line, Matt, in your review where you're sort of spelling out kind of some of what you were saying earlier, right? You say, that many of the anxieties that stoke opposition to the kinds of construction projects and rapid technological innovations favored by the author are downstream of economic inegalitarianism. People block housing construction because they fear living next to the people that our economic system provides so little income to. They block nearby transportation and energy infrastructure because they don't want to tumble down the economic ladder by impairing the value of their personal real estate assets. They resist productivity enhancing technology because they fear job loss and permanent income loss. The preservation or deepening of economic inegalitarianism could easily turn the author's utopian vision of 2050 into a dystopian nightmare. But like even before that last line, I mean, what I like about this is that it seems at least somewhat suggestive to me that it's like, okay, like let's just say, I mean, I kind of mentioned some reservations that I have about some of the zoning stuff they're into earlier, but it's like, put all that aside, right? Like, let's just assume that like a sort of 100% of the making construction easier, nurturing scientific innovation, making big, sort of public construction projects, all that stuff, right? All that stuff they're talking about, that like, let's assume for the sake of argument that 100% of that is like benevolent and desirable and stuff we want to happen, right? So then, we could sort of say, all right, we have two goals at least, right? That, we want to do redistribution, we want to have a more economically equal society, and we also want to do all of their stuff. And it seems like that passage that I just read from your review is suggestive of a strategic argument that, if anything, the order of operations might have to be create a more equal society first, so that you eliminate a lot of the incentives that people have to block the stuff that they want.
Right. Yeah. No. Yeah. That move was designed as to couple with the other move that hey, distribution is important not just because it parcels the present, but because it will parcel your future. But then secondarily, you can't put it to the side because these two things actually interact with one another. They're not separate. We just produce, and we don't tend to distribution. We would call this political economy in other contexts, right? You have to think about, wait, how do our economic proposals generate the political feedback that, creates and reproduces the system. And, how is that all going to go? In fact, if they start from there, they might understand that Marx quote a little bit better, because he's also speaking of political economy in part there. But yes, I mean, we have the political economy of, if you create a really unequal society, people become afraid of change. And I actually subsequently, I did a calculation. Let me see if I can pull it up that I posted on Twitter. That was actually about this, but I kind of just tossed it off and didn't go anywhere with it. But let's see. Yes, per capita distribution. Basically, yeah, here we go. So what I wanted to do, not to make this a math thing, is I wanted to see, okay, if there would be a way to demonstrate why people might be afraid of technological innovation, if we assume that if you insert new technology, it's going to be disruptive in a way that some people are going to lose their job and they'll get reallocated into a different job. But like, some people are definitely going to kind of fall down the ladder a little bit, right? Like, I used to have this job, and then new tech kind of made it redundant. And so now I had to go to do this other job. But the old job was like a 70th percentile job. And this is more like a 60th percentile job. And whatever, like, that's the kind of thing that happens when you introduce new technology. And so how much income would you stand to lose if you were to drop just 10 percentiles in the income distribution? So imagine you're at the 60th percentile, some shock occurs, you don't lose everything, but your job is gone, you got to get reemployed, and so you go down to the 50th. And if you were to do just that, go from the 60th to the 50th, your income would decline 20%. And that's true kind of like across the board. As you get towards the tails, the percentages go way up. But like, basically 25% to 30%, that's how much you're standing to lose if you just fall 10 points in the distribution. And so what are we looking at when we're thinking about explosive growth? Well, we get kind of like 2% a year of growth, if we're doing pretty good. So let's say you could increase that to 3% a year, which is like a 50% increase, quite a radical change. Well, it's going to take you, for that extra percent, would take you like 18 years to make up for the fact that you tumbled just 10 points in the distribution. So like, of course, you're telling me, hey man, in 18 years, you could be as well off as you were. Like, that's not going to go. But think about this again mathematically. If you squeeze the differences between the percentiles, so that it's not the case that you lose 20% of your income if you tumble 10 points, but you just lose like a 2% or 3%. Well, now the calculus changes, and you're much more invested in what is the average income of the society. Right? So a more kind of less mathy way to put it is, the more unequal the society is, the more you rationally are invested in holding on to your spot because you don't want to fall. Whereas the more equal the society is, the more rational it is for you to think about what is the best way to maximize the average outcome, because you're much closer to the average outcome. And the average outcome is going to be much more important to you than whether you're at the 40th percentile or the 60th percentile. This is what you see in the Nordic countries as well, right, is that their wage distribution is hugely compressed. Right? The gap between the 90th and 10th percentile is so much smaller than it is here, just like in the wage distribution. So in a way, like, who cares if I lose my job, because I'll get on good unemployment benefits, I'll get another job, and guess what? It's basically going to pay the same thing that I was already making, because all the jobs kind of pay the same, especially when you add in that a good chunk of your income's not even coming from your job. It's coming from the free healthcare. It's coming from the free childcare. It's coming from the free college. It's coming from the child allowance. It's coming from all these social benefits anyways. So it's, once everything is kind of all the same, you're invested in wanting to improve average outcomes. And so, it's a long way around of saying that inequality makes people afraid of change, because change could mean that you go down the ladder. And when the gaps in the ladder are big, that's a very scary proposition. And the other thing is, on the flip side, I use the example of Elon Musk, right? Musk was made rich by exactly the kind of things that they want to promote on the innovation part of the book, right? Let's subsidize these growth industries, electric vehicles, solar panels. He's got his satellite, SpaceX, right? And they made him the richest man in the world doing all that through government programs. And then he's he accumulated so much power through that wealth that he essentially became like a shadow president who is in the process of like destroying state capacity and cutting the kind of things that they actually like, like National Institutes of Health grants. They're kind of destroying academic research and STEM.
Yeah, I mean, like I mean, I'm not even particularly in a world where I know a lot of these people, but even I will know people or know people and know people and hear all this stuff. And I was like, oh, this or that person is like a scientist. And they're like, oh shit, should I get a job in another country now? Because like all this stuff is going away. Yeah, right. So I'm really glad you brought up Elon Musk, because this kind of gets into like the last, thing that I really wanted to pick you guys' brain about, which is that like Luke sort of alluded to this earlier, right? Like that the context of the book that maybe when they were first starting to write it, they assumed that we'd be under a new Democratic administration, but it's like as it is now, it is kind of this intervention in debates about what sort of, some of us would like something better than liberalism, but whatever, right? Like let's just say, to use their framing, right, what sort of liberalism should be sort of counterposed to Trumpism, if like if progressives, Democrats, whatever, like are gonna like get their groove back and like take power again. And one of the things, Luke, that I think you like kind of brought out nicely in your review is like, look, so much of this stuff seems like a really like sort of small bore concern that it's like, that's like a lot of what's driving this is, yeah, some of these like big blue cities are run terribly, right? Which, look, I live in Los Angeles. Nobody needs to convince me that premise is true, right? Like that's clearly true, right? That there are like all sorts of horrible and dysfunctional things about the way that LA, for example, is run, but like sort of treating that as this grand like utopian like thing that it's like, oh, this is the key that we need to unlock to like get everything. It's like, well, I don't know, man. It's like there are a lot of cities in the US that aren't actually run by Democrats. There are a lot of, or certainly at least like, that have big cities in Texas, that have that have like a zoning regime that like actually doesn't seem far off from what they want, right? Like, and that's kind of not that inspiring a vision, right? That like we'll sort of implement that nationally. And then also related to this, right? It's like, look, like they actually say, both of you guys quote this in your reviews, right? There's this line, and I understand it's not the only thing they say about Musk, and there's also a more negative thing later, but they say, Musk has become a lightning rod in debates over whether technological progress comes from public policy or private ingenuity. But he is a walking advertisement for what public will and private genius can unlock when they put together. I mean, Luke, do you think Musk is a compelling advertisement for that?
Well, as Matt just said, he's an advertisement for the exact opposite. I mean, he's an advertisement for the dangers of pursuing precisely this approach. And it's very funny because, as has been said already, I mean, this is already the approach that so many of America's political leaders have taken. It's like, yeah, let's just subsidize these like, mercurial tech barons, and that's how innovation happens. That's how we get, that is the font of social and economic progress. And, I think that's absurd. And actually, to tie together this and the prior conversation, I mean, I think this relates back to the bigger point here about redistribution. I mean, it seems to me that like if we want to adopt, at least in the abstract, the thrust of the conceptual thrust of the abundance agenda, and say, okay, well, yeah, sure, we agree, we want abundance, fostering innovation is the most important thing. This is kind of what the second half of the book is about. I again think that having a more egalitarian society is one of the ways you can do that, right? Because it seems to me people are a lot less likely to be creative and to innovate and to be disposed of the kinds of things that are precursors to creativity and innovation if they're suffering, if they're spending 12 hours a day in shitty, alienating jobs, or if they're having to spend most of their mental and emotional and psychological bandwidth just earning the bare necessities of life. It seems to me that the context in which people flourish, in a broad sense, is one where it's more likely to be one where people have to worry less about those kinds of things. And so again, I feel like there's an argument here that the sort of the current regime, and the current approach to innovation that this book embraces, which is the current one basically, that's what's hampering innovation, in a big way. I mean, although I guess just to make a further point, and sorry, Matt, and then you can come in, but to make a further point, I guess I also think it's maybe just a mistake to construe innovation as something that you can sort of there's a perfect regulatory framework, perfect incentive structures to have maximum innovation. I think it's a much more, particularly when it comes to scientific discovery, it's a much more nebulous process. I don't think it's as easily quantifiable. And that's why we've seen technological innovations come out of all kinds of different contexts, and there's a lot of luck involved, and it's not something that you can wonk your way into, I don't think.
Yeah, I 100% agree with that. And I think I may have made that point on the Chapo podcast when I was on it, but I think because that's a huge question that comes up in a lot of policy. I remember for many years I was having to fight this argument where people would say, well, the Nordic countries, they sure are equal, but they're not innovative. And I wrote so much stuff on it. And as part of that, you actually, you was kind of forced to ask the question, well, so what causes innovation? You start looking, and it's oh man, it kind of just comes, this sort of lightning bolt, and you got to be able to capture it and innovate it, and or capture it and implement it. That is something that is institutionally important. Right. But where it comes, I mean, I think about Finland, because that would be one of the countries, and it's well, what is this? What is something Finland contributed? They contributed the Linux operating system, which is just this guy, Linus Torvalds, whose dad, by the way, is a communist. And I don't know, he's just a guy. He was a coder. He was at the University of Helsinki. He made this thing. It kind of took off. And now, the vast majority of the computers in the world are run on it, and including, I'm sure, this server that we're on right now. And, it's did that come because anything Finland did? I don't know. But I do think there are definitely some, intuitive things that you can look at where you can start thinking about, it's at least plausible that inequality in our country might push against innovation. For the reasons you gave, Luke, but also for reasons related to just horrible allocation of talent. If you think one of the things that drives innovation is there are some people who are kind of smart, kind of tinkery, kind of interested, who where do we put those people?
They go work at McKinsey, right? They go work on Wall Street.
No, the smartest kid I knew in high school, I went to a huge high school, had 4,000 kids in North Texas, and he won every science competition. There's state science competitions. He went to an Ivy League school. He was really, really smart, clever guy. I met up with him a few years after, I don't know, maybe 5-6 years later, and it was what are you up to? And he worked on Wall Street, of course, but what did he do? And he was so I follow the Monster Energy stock. And we trade on Monster Energy stock movements. I'm oh, that's good. All right. But when in high school, he's I'm going to do physics. He was just all into that stuff. And I'm that guy probably could have come up with something, or people like him in aggregate may have come up with something. And now he's sitting there writing reports on the price movement of Monster Energy securities. It's that can't be good for innovation.
Let me just say one more thing here to add to that, because like insofar as I can envision any kind of institutionally specific way to foster innovation, like it seems to me that again, like the Silicon Valley model for technological and scientific progress, for invention, where it's like, okay, we're going to have this really, really high risk environment where huge amounts of capital are wasted on, you name it, fucking, WeWork, cryptocurrency, Juicero, like all these kind of things. But then for every like 100 of those, we're going to get, probably not even an iPhone, but I don't know, some consumer product that people actually like. It seems to me that a lot of the most important innovations that have happened, at least since the 20th century, have come out of public investment or public universities or publicly subsidized scientific research. And I think one of the reasons for that is because that type of research, that type of scientific inquiry, it's not really happening in a competitive environment in the same way, right? If you are a brilliant scientist, say, and you work, or a brilliant guy who watches the Monster Energy stock, if you are working for a private company, that company has a market incentive not to share information, not to share expertise, that kind of thing, because they're trying to compete. And that's like, you see that with like pharmaceutical companies all the time, right? That's just one example. When you're doing public research,
there's also like it's also harder to do, I think, certain kinds of basic research, that like might or might not bear any kind of useful fruit anytime soon, right? I mean, like you even mentioned, like when you were sort of trying to give the due to, private innovation, you even mentioned the iPhone. It's like, look, people watch the show, seen me say this many times, but it's like
it's all public. All the technologies came out of public research.
Yeah, I mean, right? The only TED Talk I ever tell people to watch is the Mariana Mazzucato one, where she's talking about like how like everything in this thing that like actually makes it a smartphone instead of a dumb phone, came from like the Defense Department or public universities or whatever, right? Like, and I don't want to overstate what you can learn from that, because like I do agree with you that I mean like the like sort of trying to figure out exactly what the causes of innovation are is hard, but I mean like it does seem at least suggestive that like the secret sauce is not having a private company do it.
It is important to note, for in fairness to the authors, that and I think this was Derek's part of the book, at the end of this part of the book, he does on some level kind of acknowledge that they don't really know, and then but says like we can fund a meta science to figure it out, right? Science. So if we do, but then I thought, oh my God, we're gonna have so many debates about which scientists to fund to do the meta science, and should it be early career ones, and what should the regulatory? We just recreating this problem.
This is a return to like the most ridiculous tendencies of like the Enlightenment. Like I think it was Francis Bacon who started writing this text called the Novum Organum, where the point of it was just, it was going to be a perfectly like streamlined, rationalized method for every form of inquiry. So whatever your question was, this was going to be like, like this kind of almost, I guess, metaphysically or rationally grounded way of like doing all forms of inquiry, no matter like what they were. So this was like a menu that any person could use, regardless of their level of expertise, to find the truth about something. And this didn't just apply to science, it applied to like philosophical and moral inquiries as well. And so I'd forgotten about that passage, but it's really fascinating. Like there's this concession that like, yeah, we don't know how innovation happens, but then they think that problem itself is one that you can like technocratically resolve. It's like, well, we're going to have a meta science, like, because fundamentally everything is just a puzzle. And if you apply enough wonk expertise, you can solve every problem. And it's like, can we just give poor people money and have universal social programs instead? Like, what are we doing here?
Yeah, I mean, and again, I think that the point, maybe like kind of the critique of the whole thing that I find the most compelling, because and I don't, with the stuff we've been talking about for the last few minutes, I don't want to give anybody the wrong impression, right? Like, I don't want to talk about these guys like they're libertarians. Like, they do want, like, state involvement in a lot of this stuff, although there's some ambiguity. But is just that it's like, look, the idea that we should, like, focus on, innovation and growth and making it easier to do ambitious construction progress and, technological change, and maybe, like, de-emphasize this redistributive stuff that, the liberals have been far too concerned about, because, Bernie Sanders has been running the Democratic Party for the last, 40 years, right? We should de-emphasize a lot of this stuff. Is like, beyond the sort of normative critique of it, that I think is, like, correct. Like, I do actually think equality matters in and of itself, but, like, is just like, yeah, look, the two, the sort of point Matt was making, like, it's like, look, the two can't be separated. That you have, on the one hand, by creating a very unequal society, you give people lots of rational incentives to resist a lot of this stuff, and by just sort of focusing on, like, funneling state support into anything that looks innovation-y, without worrying about the distribution, right? You make Elon Musk the richest man in the world, and then he, like, dismantles all the parts of the state that Ezra Klein and Derek Thompson, care the most about, right? Which is, like, seemed really suggestive to me that, like, that this is not, that, like, the sort of, like, innovation and construction first approach, right, is not going to be, long-term viable, even on its own terms. But I think we could keep going forever, but you guys both been really generous with your time. Matt, Luke, thank you guys so much. Luke, where can people find your stuff?
Well, I got on Substack recently, along with, lots of writers I'm sure your viewers like, greats like Matt Iglesias. So I'm on Substack now, LukeWSavage.com, and I'm on, Twitter and all the other places.
Fair enough. Matt?
Yeah, you can follow me at Matt Bruenig on Twitter. People's Policy Project is my think tank. If you're interested in labor relations, National Labor Relations Board stuff, you can go to nlrbedge.com. And I have my own podcast, patreon.com/thebruenigs.
Awesome. Thanks, guys.
Cheers.
Thanks.
All right. Really enjoyed that. That, again, for my money at least, I think that's, like, one of the more interesting episodes that we've done in a while. Yeah, we are going to go to the post game now. And, well, I guess one last plug, right? Because it is in 3 days. So again, as we said earlier, if you are going to be in the San Francisco Bay Area on Thursday, at 6 p.m. at the El Rio in San Francisco, 6 p.m. on Thursday, Jason Miles and I are doing a live podcast. There's a ticket link down below in the description for this episode. Come check us out. It should be a very good time. But yeah, meanwhile, though, if you haven't had quite enough abundance talk for one evening, if you're like, yeah, that was good, but I'm still feeling a little abundancy.
I need an abundance of abundance talk, and I haven't quite gotten it right.
Yeah, exactly. In the post game for patrons, which we're about to go to, we have debate breakdown regulars, Victor Bruzzone and Ethan from the Confronting Capital channel are going to be joining us to watch the co-author of Abundance, Derek Thompson, do a little mini debate on it that he did on Breaking Points. So we are going to go to that now. If you're already a patron and have thus marked yourself as one of the best humans who's ever lived, you should already have a email in your inbox with a link to the post game and a slightly optimistic, not too bad tonight, estimate for when that was going to start. If you're not a patron, there's no time like the present. Patreon.com/Ben Burgis. You get these patron exclusive post games after every regular Monday night episode. You get access to the Discord server. Sometimes things, are released in advance to patrons before they're released to everybody else. We try to give you some benefits to show you that we appreciate what you're doing, but of course, it's not a subscription service. We're all swimming in free content, right? It's solidarity, right? If you like what we're doing here, if you enjoy the podcast, you want to keep the lights on, you want to pay all the nice people you see on the screen, then do consider becoming a patron. Help us do it. And this is all, it's all a way of saying thank you. So in any case, that's patreon.com/Ben Burgis. And if you are a patron or you become one in the next 30 seconds, I'll see you in about a minute. Left is best.